A man chases a rabbit into the woods. He never catches it. Instead, he finds a cardboard box, the kind department stores used for bassinets. Inside is a child, naked, beaten so badly his organs were bleeding inside him, starved down to nothing, his hair freshly cut, his nails freshly trimmed. Someone groomed this boy like they were preparing him for a photograph, and then someone beat him to death and threw him away like trash on the side of the road. For 65 years, no one knew his name. Not one person came forward. Not one parent ever asked where he went. This is the story of the boy the whole country searched for, and the family that never once looked back. On February 25, 1957, a young man named Frederick Benonis was driving through the Fox Chase section of northeast Philadelphia when he spotted a rabbit darting into a patch of woods near Susquehanna Road. On impulse, he pulled over and followed it in. What he found instead of the rabbit was a cardboard box, a bassinet box, the type a department store would use to sell an infant crib. Inside, wrapped in a cheap cotton blanket, was the body of a small boy. Benonis had actually driven past that same spot once before, checking muskrat traps he'd sprung out of dislike for their cruelty. On that earlier visit, he'd glanced into the box and convinced himself he was looking at a large, unusually realistic doll. He said nothing. The real reason he stayed quiet had nothing to do with the boy. He'd been parking in that area to watch students at a nearby school for girls, and he didn't want anyone asking why he was there. It wasn't until the next day, when he heard a radio report about a missing 4-year-old girl from New Jersey, that it hit him. That wasn't a doll. He went to police and reported what he'd seen. What investigators found at that scene would haunt the city of Philadelphia for the next 65 years. The boy was naked. He had been dead for at least a day, possibly longer. He was small. Investigators would eventually estimate his age at somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, though his malnourishment made it difficult to be precise. His body was covered in old and new bruises, some healed, some fresh. An autopsy would later reveal a subdural hemorrhage, fluid in his chest cavity, and injuries consistent with repeated blunt force trauma inflicted over time. This was not one bad night. This was a pattern. And then there were the details that made no sense. His hair had been cut recently, and unevenly, crudely trimmed close to the scalp, as if someone had done it themselves in a hurry. His fingernails had been clipped. There were surgical-looking scars on his ankle, his groin, and his chin, along with marks that resembled where an IV line might have been inserted. Someone had, at some point, cared for this child in a clinical way. In that same environment, or a different one entirely, had also starved him and beaten him until he died. Detectives combed the surrounding area and found more items scattered nearby: a child's cap, a small corduroy cap, and other scraps of clothing, none of which led anywhere. The box itself became one of the case's earliest leads. Investigators traced its manufacturer to a J.C. Penney or similar bassinet line, and eventually connected it to a store in Upper Darby in Delaware County, just outside the city. But a box sold to hundreds of customers doesn't hand you a name. Police took the boy's fingerprints. They circulated flyers. They held him at the morgue for weeks, then months, hoping someone, a neighbor, a relative, a teacher, would come forward. No one did. Eventually, the medical examiner's office had a mortician embalm the child and dress him, and a photograph of his face was placed in the window of a local Penn fruit grocery store where thousands of Philadelphians walked past it every week. A homicide detective's wife personally altered a suit for the boy to be buried in. Over 400,000 flyers were distributed nationwide. Still, nothing. With no name and no family to claim him, the child was buried in a potter's field in an unmarked grave. The only marker anyone gave him was a small stone reading "America's Unknown Child." For decades, he existed in the public imagination only as the boy in the box, a ghost story with a real body attached to it. The case became an obsession for a small number of people who refused to let it go cold in the way most cases go cold. Chief among them was Remington Bristow, an investigator with the medical examiner's office, who spent more than 3 decades of his own time chasing leads on his own dime. Bristow pursued dozens of theories, some credible, some increasingly strange, including consulting a psychic who directed him toward a foster home, roughly a mile and a half from where the body was found. He never solved it. He died in 1993, still convinced he was close. The Vidocq Society, a Philadelphia-based group of retired detectives, forensic scientists, and profilers dedicated to unsolved murders, adopted the case as something close to a mission. Investigators exhumed the boy's body in 1998, specifically to extract a DNA sample from a tooth, a sample that, at the time, could be compared to nothing. The technology to actually use it didn't exist yet. In 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an updated forensic facial reconstruction, giving the public a new image of what the boy might have looked like in life. In 2019, the body was exhumed a second time to gather fresh genetic material using techniques that hadn't existed 20 years earlier. Over the decades, theories about who he was and who killed him multiplied. Investigators looked hard at a couple who ran a foster home in the area. There was a persistent theory that the boy had been a victim of trafficking, killed by a caregiver in a moment of rage. Even Benonis, the man who found the body, was quietly looked at for a time, simply because he was the only person connected to the case at all. None of it went anywhere. For 65 years, the file stayed open, and the boy stayed nameless. The break came not from a confession or a witness, but from a relative who had no idea what she was about to unlock. Working with forensic genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick and her organization, Identifinders International, Philadelphia investigators identified a distant cousin who had voluntarily uploaded her DNA to a public genealogy database, the same kind of consumer service people use to find out where their ancestors came from. That single upload gave investigators a genetic thread. They traced it outward, encouraging the cousin's mother, a first cousin of the boy, to also submit her DNA. Fitzpatrick described the process to reporters as something like solving a giant Sudoku puzzle, piecing together fragments of degraded, decades-old genetic material that she compared to confetti. Slowly, a family tree took shape. Investigators used the genetic connections to work out both the maternal and paternal lines, eventually landing on a birth certificate. A court order forced its release. And there, finally, was a name. On November the 30th, 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department announced they had identified the child. On December 8th, 2022, nearly 66 years after Frederick Benonis followed a rabbit into the woods, they said it publicly. The boy in the box was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953, in Philadelphia. His family had lived near 61st and Market Street in West Philadelphia. He had never been issued a Social Security number. No missing persons report was ever filed for him. Both of his biological parents were, by then, already dead. Police confirmed Joseph had living relatives on both sides of his family. People who, for whatever reason, had never once come forward in 65 years of national headlines, flyers, a facial reconstruction, and a grave marked unknown. When investigators finally spoke with those relatives, they learned Joseph had siblings. Detectives declined to release most of what they'd learned about his short life, and they declined to name any suspects, though Philadelphia Police Captain Jason Smith stated plainly that investigators had suspicions about who was responsible for the boy's death. He would not say who. Identifying Joseph did not solve his murder. Both of his parents were dead by the time his name was restored, and detectives have acknowledged that key witnesses have largely died as well. Then, Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw said at the announcement that the case had haunted the department, the city, and the country for 65 years, and that giving Joseph back his name did not close his story. It opened a new chapter in it. On January 13, 2023, what would have been Joseph's 71st birthday, the stone reading America's Unknown Child was replaced with a new headstone bearing his actual name and photograph. Relatives on his father's side attended, including a cousin who had provided the DNA sample that helped identify him decades after his death. To this day, no one has been arrested. No one has been charged. Philadelphia police still consider it an open homicide investigation, and they are still asking for anyone with information from that era to come forward. 69 years later, somebody out there still knows exactly what happened inside that house.